James Mitchell, the most underestimated naval mechanic in the region, arrived at Newport Naval Base thinking he was going to fix a simple engine. But millionaire Sarah Thompson laughed when he approached the submarine USS Hampton that had been stopped since 2006. Not even the engineers from England could make this tin can work. "Imagine you, a backyard garage mechanic," the millionaire widow mocked. "If you can make this submarine sail again, I'll marry you." She laughed with contempt. But when he put his ear to the steel hull, he heard a strange crack, a sound that nobody else noticed. "Hello, it's a pleasure to have you back. Please leave your like and tell me in the comments which city and state you're watching from." In silence, James raised his head with his face dirty with oil and warned, "If you activate the pressurization system now, you have no idea what's going to happen." James Mitchell was 32 years old that March 2024, but his eyes carried the wisdom of someone who started working as a teenager. His calloused hands, marked by small scars from hot metal and sharp tools, told stories that no technical manual ever recorded. He woke up every day at 4:30 in the morning in the simple house he shared with his mother Mary in the Riverside district, outskirts of Newport Harbor. The routine was always the same. Strong black coffee, bread with butter, and that silent ritual of putting on the faded blue coveralls that were already 12 years old. That specific morning, James looked through the window of the bus that took him to another day of work at Robert's Naval Workshop, specialized in maritime equipment. He thought about the phone call he had received the night before, someone calling himself a commander from Newport Naval Base, the one everyone in the region knew, the largest military vessel maintenance center on the East Coast. The man who introduced himself as Commander Robert Davis had been direct. "James, we need you. We have a submarine here that's been stopped for almost 18 years, and we've already spent millions trying to make it work." Your name was the only one the old-timers here mentioned with respect. James had almost hung up immediately. Newport Naval Base wasn't just any place. It was where he had started at 16 as an assistant to his stepfather, Anthony, who operated the underwater maintenance systems. It was there that he learned from the veterans, those men and women with rough hands and deep knowledge, the secrets that make the difference between a machine functioning and a machine really performing. It was there that Robert Santos, the legendary base mechanic, taught him something that changed his life forever. "James, boy, submarines talk. They don't use words like we do, but they talk. You just have to know how to listen." And James learned to listen. For years, during night shifts, when the base became quieter, he would put his hand on the metal structures of the Hampton-class submarines, on the propulsion systems, on the giant diesel engines. Every crack, every vibration, every metallic whisper told a story. He could identify a hydraulic system failure just by the timbre of the sound the pump made. He could predict when a compressor would fail 3 weeks before any diagnostic equipment detected the problem. The veterans said he had a gift, but James knew it wasn't a gift. It was attention. It was respect for the machine. It was understanding that each piece of equipment has its own personality. But life had taken James away from the naval base. When Robert retired in 2007, many things changed. The new commanders didn't value practical knowledge. They wanted diplomas and international certificates. James, who had never set foot in a university, was gradually pushed aside until he left. He spent years working in smaller workshops, fixing fishing boats, launches, until Robert Johnson hired him for the specialized workshop. He was good, very good, and his reputation had grown. But returning to the naval base, that stirred up complicated feelings. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, in Charleston, Sarah Thompson woke up in the luxury mansion in the mountains, with that familiar feeling of weight in her chest. She was 29 years old and had a life that many people would envy. Successful businesswoman, heiress to one of the largest naval fortunes on the East Coast, millionaire widow of an admiral. But Sarah carried an emptiness that no money could fill. 2 years earlier, her husband, Admiral Michael Thompson, had passed from a sudden heart attack. leaving a naval empire in Sarah's hands. Michael was a man of the sea who had started as a simple sailor and built a fortune with his own hands. Sarah, who had always worked in air-conditioned offices, dealing with spreadsheets and board meetings, never really understood what her husband did. But when Michael passed, the investors expected Sarah to take over. And she, desperate to prove she was worthy of the Thompson name she carried, accepted. The problem was that Sarah didn't understand anything about navigation or naval mechanics. She knew how to read financial statements, knew how to negotiate contracts, but when the subject was maritime operation, she was completely lost. Her solution was what people like her always do: hire the best, the most expensive, the most certified. She brought consultants from England, engineers from Germany, specialists from Canada. She spent fortunes on analyses and complex technical reports that filled entire shelves in her office. And none of this solved the biggest problem of the inheritance she received: the submarine USS Hampton S-30, a vessel valued at $120 million that had been completely stopped since December 2006. Sarah had inherited that problem along with the company, and it was becoming an obsession. 15 international specialists, 3 years of attempts, $35 million spent on parts and diagnostics, and the damn submarine wouldn't sail. Each month that passed, the company lost million-dollar contracts. The investors were getting impatient. Some were already talking about dismantling the submarine and selling it as scrap. That morning, Sarah was irritated. She had just left a video conference with the investors where she was practically accused of incompetence. One of them, Dr. Charles Anderson, was direct to the point. "Sarah, your husband Michael would have solved this in a week. You've already spent more on consultants than the submarine is worth. Either you solve it or we sell the company." The word incompetent wasn't said, but it was clear in the air. Sarah arrived at Charleston Airport to catch the flight to Newport Harbor with that mixture of anger and desperation. She needed to be present at the base. She needed to show a firm grip. Commander Robert had mentioned something about hiring another specialist, but Sarah barely paid attention. Another specialist. More money thrown away, she thought bitterly. James arrived at the main entrance of Newport Naval Base at 7 in the morning sharp. The giant metal gate with the Navy emblem engraved was exactly as he remembered. 17 years had passed, but that characteristic smell of sea breeze mixed with diesel and lubricating oil was the same. He presented his documents to the security guard, a young man he didn't know, and was directed to the administrative building. The administration building had been renovated, but the structure was the same. James climbed the concrete stairs to the second floor, where the meeting room was located. His steel-toed safety boots, those black ones that were over 8 years old, made a familiar sound on the floor. He wore his usual blue coveralls, naval helmet under his arm, and carried his basic toolbox. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't sophistication, but it was who he was. When James entered the meeting room, 3 men in uniform were sitting around the table. One of them was Robert, whom he recognized by his phone voice. The other 2 were strangers. Robert stood up with a smile. "James, good that you agreed to come. Let me introduce you." But before Robert could finish, the door opened again, and Sarah Thompson entered. She had arrived from Charleston that morning, directly from the airport, still wearing an expensive suit and high heels that contrasted absurdly with the military environment. Sarah looked at James, and her expression was one of visible confusion. "Commander," said Sarah, with that tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I asked for coffee and some cookies for the meeting with the specialist. Could you check what happened?" Robert blinked, confused. "But Mrs. Sarah, the specialist has already arrived. This is James Mitchell." Sarah looked at James again, now with something between surprise and disbelief. Her eyes scanned the faded blue coveralls, the worn boots, the helmet under his arm. There was an embarrassing silence. "You're the specialist?" Sarah asked, and the tone of the question carried something that James knew well: doubt incredulity, poorly disguised contempt. "I am," James answered with a firm voice, looking directly into her eyes. James Mitchell, specialist in underwater naval systems, focused on Hampton-class submarine recovery. Sarah gave a half-smile, one of those that don't reach the eyes. "I understand. And what is your academic background? Naval engineering, Federal University?" "I don't have a university degree," James said without looking away. "My training comes from 16 years working directly with this equipment. I started here at this base in 2008 when I was 16 years old. Could you sense the change in the air?" Sarah straightened in her chair, and that half-smile became more pronounced, more condescending. "Ah, I understand. No formal academic training." She looked at Robert with an expression that clearly said, "Is this what you brought?" "Commander Robert?" Robert tried to intervene. "James has an exceptional reputation in the region. The veterans who worked with Admiral Michael always mentioned him." "My husband," Sarah interrupted him, "hired many people out of sentimentality, but we're dealing with a $120 million submarine that had 15 engineers trained at the world's best universities trying to reactivate it. Engineers with doctorates, with international certifications." She looked at James again, without wanting to disrespect, "But you don't seem to have the technical profile necessary for this type of challenge." James felt that familiar sensation in his stomach. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was tiredness. The tiredness of always having to always prove that he knew what he was doing. "Can I at least see the submarine?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. "See?" Sarah laughed, a short, dry laugh. "Look, I appreciate your willingness, but we can't have people without adequate qualifications approaching equipment of this magnitude. It's a matter of safety, legal responsibility. You understand?" She paused, and then her eyes gleamed with malice. "But you know what? I'll make a proposal. If you really can make this submarine sail again, something that specialists from 3 countries couldn't achieve, I'll marry you." She laughed loudly, as if she had told the funniest joke in the world. "Of course, this will never happen, but at least it'll be fun to watch you try." The men in the room were visibly uncomfortable. Commander Robert cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sarah, maybe it would be better." "Is it a bet?" James interrupted her, his voice dangerously calm. Sarah stopped laughing and looked at him with renewed interest. "What did you say? Is it a formal bet?" James repeated, keeping his gaze fixed on her. "If I manage to make the submarine sail, you marry me." Sarah laughed even louder. "My God! Are you being serious? I'm one of the richest women on the East Coast. You really think I would marry a mechanic without a degree who lives in the projects?" She leaned forward. "But why not? It'll be fun, I accept the bet. When you fail, and you will fail, I want you to leave here and never come back. Deal?" James extended his hand. Sarah shook it, still smiling with disdain. "Deal." The following days were a slow and painful descent for James. Sarah didn't dismiss him, no. She did something worse. She turned him into entertainment. In the first week, she organized a technical meeting with the entire team of international engineers who were working on the submarine case. The Englishman, Michael Brown, with his doctorate from Oxford. The German, David Wilson, specialist in submarine propulsion. The Canadian, Jennifer Parker, systems engineer from General Dynamics. 5 men in suits, 2 women in white lab coats with certification badges hanging from their necks. And James. Well, James wasn't notified of the meeting. He found out by chance when he was in the base cafeteria having coffee and heard 2 technicians commenting, "The big meeting is at 2, right? The one with all the foreigners." James looked at his watch. 1:40. He ran upstairs to the conference room on the 2nd floor. He arrived sweating, and when he opened the door, all eyes turned to him. Sarah was standing, presenting charts on a projector, wearing a navy blue dress that cost more than James's annual salary. She stopped, looked at James, with that expression of someone interrupted in the middle of something important. "Can I help?" she asked with simulated coldness, but James could see the gleam of amusement in her eyes. "The commander hired me to work on the submarine," James said, trying to catch his breath. "I thought I should be in this meeting." "Oh, yes, James." Sarah pronounced his name as if she were savoring each syllable. "Look, this is a very technical discussion. Pressurization systems, sonar circuit analysis, engineering specifications that require specific training. We don't want you to feel lost. Why don't you wait in the reception? When we need something more practical, we'll call you." Michael Brown let out a low chuckle, and Jennifer Parker looked at her laptop, clearly uncomfortable. James felt the blood rise to his face, but kept his voice firm. "I understand pressurization systems. I worked with submarines for years." Of course," Sarah said with that maternal, condescending tone. "But one thing is working as a basic mechanic, tightening screws, changing oil. Another thing is understanding the engineering behind it. They're different levels of complexity, you understand. It's nothing personal." James stood at the door for 3 more seconds that seemed eternal. Then he left, closing the door slowly. Outside, he leaned against the corridor wall and breathed deeply. His hands trembled slightly. He thought about his stepfather, Anthony, who had passed 5 years ago from cirrhosis. He thought about Robert Santos, who had taught him everything about those submarines. He thought about his mother, Mary, who woke up every day at 5 in the morning to clean houses of rich people. "You are stronger than this, my son," he heard his mother's voice in his head. "You always were." But being strong didn't make it less humiliating. The following weeks established a cruel pattern. Sarah allowed James to access the technical documents, but always supervised by some engineer. When he went to inspect the submarine at the shipyard, a security technician followed him closely, alleging protocol. James wasn't stupid. He knew that none of the international engineers had that same constant supervision. But the worst was the way Sarah treated him in weekly meetings. She always sat at the head of the table, impeccably dressed, and asked questions that were clearly traps. "James, how do you explain the fact that the pressure sensors don't detect irregularities if you insist there are problems in the system?" "James, if the specialist from England didn't find structural flaws, what's the basis of your theory about possible leaks?" Each question came accompanied by that cold smile, those eyes that gleamed with cruel satisfaction when he struggled to answer questions formulated to make him look incompetent. And it was always in front of all the other specialists, who watched with a mixture of embarrassment and superiority. During submarine inspections, James observed everything with meticulous attention. The USS Hampton S-30 was a magnificent creature, even stopped. 203 feet long, 1,400 tons when submerged, diesel-electric engine with power to navigate up to 20 knots on the surface, capacity for 30 crew members and 45-day autonomy when submerged. It was one of the most advanced submarines on the East Coast, and was there, silent, lifeless, for 18 years. James spent hours examining every detail, putting his hand on the hull, feeling the temperature, looking for residual vibrations, noting everything in a worn notebook, possible failure points, systems that deserved special attention, modifications that he noticed had been made over the years. And he began to notice things, small things, that the engineers with their sophisticated equipment weren't seeing. In a weekly analysis meeting, James raised his hand timidly. Sarah, surprised, gave him the word with a theatrically magnanimous gesture. "I noticed that the ballast system has some handwritten markings on the main valves. They're not factory markings. They look like modifications made right here at the base." Michael Brown frowned. "Handmade modifications? Impossible. We checked all specifications against the original 1998 manual. Everything is according to standard. But the markings are there," James insisted. "I saw them. There's a valve with handwritten initials, RS, and a date from 2005. Sarah made a note on her tablet. "Interesting. Michael, could you verify this?" Michael nodded reluctantly. The meeting continued. 3 days later, at another meeting, Sarah presented an important discovery. Engineer Michael identified unauthorized modifications in the ballast system, she announced proudly, showing photos on the projector. This could be a crucial clue to understanding the failure. James widened his eyes. Those were exactly the valves he had mentioned. Michael was receiving credit for his observation. He looked around the room. Commander Robert, who had hired him, avoided his gaze. The other engineers took notes, as if that were really Michael's discovery. "Excuse me," James interrupted, his voice trembling slightly, "but I mentioned those valves 3 days ago at Thursday's meeting." Sarah looked at him with that neutral expression, but James could see the malicious satisfaction in her eyes. "Yes, you mentioned some markings, but Michael did the appropriate technical analysis, specifically identified which valves, took precise measurements, compared them with international standards. It's the process that matters, you understand. Anyone can see a mark. Understanding what it means requires expertise," Michael added with his heavy English accent. "Scientific precision is fundamental. We cannot work with, how do you say, hunches and intuitions." James felt something break inside him. It wasn't the first time they had stolen his credit, but there, in that room, in front of 8 professionals, with Sarah observing every second of his humiliation with visible pleasure, that hurt differently. He remained silent for the rest of the meeting, but could feel Sarah's eyes on him, like a predator watching wounded prey. After the meeting, when everyone had left, Sarah approached James. She smelled of expensive perfume and power. "James," she said, her voice soft as silk, "are you okay? You seem upset." James looked at her, at those dark eyes that gleamed with false concern. "I'm fine," he answered. "It's just that sometimes it's frustrating when you contribute something and—" Sarah laughed, a crystalline and cruel sound. "Oh, my dear James, do you really think observing markings on valves is technical contribution?" She leaned closer. "Let me explain something about the real world. Ideas are cheap. Anyone can have ideas. What matters is execution, credibility, having the qualifications to be taken seriously. You may have noticed those markings, but Michael has a doctorate, has international experience, has credibility. When he speaks, people listen. When you speak, well, you understand." She touched his arm lightly, a gesture that could seem maternal, if not for the cold eyes. "Our bet is still on, isn't it? You have a few more weeks to work a miracle. I'm anxious to see what's going to happen." James felt his blood boiling in his veins, but kept his voice controlled. "The bet is on. And Sarah, when I make this submarine sail, and I will, you'll discover that underestimating someone by appearance is the most expensive mistake a person can make." Sarah laughed loudly, genuinely amused. "Oh, James, you really are adorable. I can barely wait to see you try." She walked away, her high heels clicking on the marble floor, leaving James alone in the conference room with the smell of her expensive perfume and the crushing weight of his own determination. That night, he called his mother. "Son, are you okay?" Mary asked, sensing something in his voice. "I am, Mom. Just tired. It's difficult work. Do you want to give up?" "No, Mom. I won't give up. Your father would be proud of you, my son. He always said you had a special gift with those machines." "I know, Mom, and I'm going to prove it." When James hung up, he looked through his simple room window at the distant lights of the naval base. Somewhere in that giant complex was the submarine USS Hampton S-30, waiting for someone who knew how to listen to what it had to say. James closed his eyes, and for the first time in weeks smiled. Tomorrow he would really begin. Tomorrow he would show Sarah Thompson and all those diploma engineers that true knowledge didn't come from expensive universities. It came from respect, attention, years listening to what machines had to say. And this submarine, James was certain, had a lot to say. The following 2 weeks were a festival of humiliations, carefully orchestrated by Sarah Thompson. The millionaire widow had discovered a new pastime, turning James into entertainment for her wealthy friends. On the first Monday of April, She organized a lunch for the wives of the company's investors. 8 elegant women, perfectly dressed, sitting in the VIP meeting room at the base, tasting shrimp and champagne while discussing the submarine's technical problems as if it were an amusing television show. Sarah presented James as if he were an exotic curiosity. "Ladies, let me introduce you to our special mechanic. James here made a bet with me. He thinks he can fix our problematic submarine. If he succeeds, I marry him." The women laughed as if Sarah had told the joke of the century. One of them, Linda Wilson, wife of one of the main investors, almost choked on her champagne. "Seriously, Sarah? A mechanic? And look at that romantic proposal." Sarah smiled maliciously. "Right, Linda. Can you imagine if it worked? Me, married to someone who makes in a month what I spend on a handbag. It would be quite a story to tell at dinners." The laughter echoed through the room, while James stood there in his coveralls, holding technical reports he had prepared about the submarine failures. "James, dear," Sarah said with false sweetness, "why don't you explain to the ladies what your revolutionary theory about the submarine is?" The women leaned forward with malicious expectation, like circus spectators waiting for the clown to stumble. James took a deep breath. "The main ballast system has an undocumented modification that affects weight distribution. This causes instability in dives and—" Patricia Harris, a blonde about 45 years old, loaded with jewelry, interrupted him. "Sorry, but could you speak in English? This ballast and distribution stuff we don't understand," James tried to simplify. "When the submarine tries to dive, it becomes unbalanced because someone modified the valves without documenting it. It's like if you changed your car's engine without writing down what you did." "Oh, I get it," Linda clapped. "So it's like when my mechanic works on my BMW and doesn't explain properly." "Exactly," Patricia laughed. "That's why I always take it to the dealership. At least there they have qualified people." The insinuations were clear as water. Sarah observed everything with visible satisfaction, savoring every second of James's humiliation. "Ladies, you know I've always liked supporting social projects, and James here is quite a project. Imagine the social responsibility, giving opportunity to someone who would never have a chance to work with cutting-edge technology. It's almost charity, don't you think?" The women agreed enthusiastically, talking about their own charity projects as if James weren't there, as if he were an object. After the visitors left, Sarah approached James with that smile that had become familiar. "Did you enjoy the presentation? The ladies thought you were cute." James stared at her. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" Sarah feigned innocence. "Offering professional growth opportunity, giving visibility to your work. Why are you publicly humiliating me?" "Oh, my dear James," Sarah laughed softly. "I'm not doing anything. You're the one putting yourself in these situations. If you feel humiliated, maybe it's because deep down you know you don't belong in this place." James felt anger growing, but forced his voice to remain calm. "Our bet is still on." "Of course it is," Sarah clapped. "I'm loving every minute. You have a few more weeks for the miracle, and I'm anxious to see the grand finale." The following Monday, Sarah escalated the humiliation. She invited a reporter from Maritime Today magazine to do a story about the submarine recovery efforts. The reporter, Kevin Thompson, arrived with a photographer and complete equipment. Sarah orchestrated everything like a theatrical piece. "Kevin, let me introduce you to our technical team. Here we have Michael Brown, doctor from Oxford, world specialist in submarine propulsion. David Wilson, PhD from the Technical University of Berlin. Jennifer Parker, chief engineer from General Dynamics. And here," she made a dramatic pause, "we have James Mitchell, our local consultant. He has a very interesting theory about the submarine." Kevin picked up his notepad. "What's your background, James?" 16 years of practical experience," James answered. "Ah, I see. Self-taught. And what's your theory?" James began to explain about the ballast system modifications, but Sarah subtly interrupted him. "Kevin, let me contextualize. James here made an interesting bet with me. If he can make the submarine work, I marry him. It's a very creative approach to solving engineering problems, don't you think? The reporter seemed confused. A marriage bet? How so? Sarah laughed. It's local folklore, Kevin. The people here have some interesting beliefs about machines and relationships. It's quite picturesque. We're documenting everything as part of the process. Of course, the real solution will come from our international specialists. During the interview, Sarah managed to make James appear as a folkloric figure, almost comical. His technical observations were presented as local superstitions. His discoveries about the modifications were credited to the foreign engineers, and the bet was painted as a regional eccentricity that Sarah tolerated out of kindness. When the article came out in the magazine 2 weeks later, James appeared in a single photo at the end of the article, identified as local mechanic who believes he can fix the submarine through traditional methods. The caption mentioned the marriage bet as an example of popular traditions in the region. Sarah had the article framed and hung on the meeting room wall. Every time James entered, he saw his own image ridiculed, immortalized as folkloric curiosity. But public humiliations weren't even the worst. The worst was how Sarah systematically sabotaged any progress James made. When he identified that the pressurization system had defective valves, Sarah organized an inspection with all the foreign engineers. The night before the inspection, she had the security technician replace the valves, with others identical but functional. When James pointed out the problem the next day, the valves were perfect. Michael Brown looked at the instruments. The valves are perfect, James. Perhaps you made an error. Sarah watched James get confused, trying to understand how the valves had been fixed overnight. Maybe you were mistaken, James. It happens with those who don't have formal training in precision diagnostics. Another time, James discovered that the ventilation system had clogged filters that prevented adequate circulation. He made a detailed report with photos and measurements. Sarah scheduled a verification for the following week. When they arrived at the submarine, the filters were clean and new. David Wilson shook his head. I see no problems here. The filters are new. James stood there looking at the filters he had photographed full of debris a week before. Sarah approached him with false concern. James, are you okay? You seem confused lately. Maybe the stress of the bet is affecting your perception. The worst episode happened when James finally got complete access to the submarine's computer system. He spent 2 entire nights analyzing error codes, identifying failure patterns, mapping software problems that nobody had noticed. It was meticulous technical work that definitively proved his competence. James discovered that the navigation system had a bug in the depth algorithm that caused cascade failures in other systems. It was a real, documentable problem that explained many of the inexplicable failures the submarine presented. He prepared a complete presentation with code screenshots, line-by-line analysis, correction proposals. It was work of superior level to anything the foreign engineers had produced. James was excited. Finally, he had something incontestable. On the morning of the presentation, James arrived early to prepare the equipment. When he turned on his laptop, all files had disappeared. Empty folder, weeks of work, evaporated. He tried to recover the data, but the hard drive had been completely formatted. Sarah arrived shortly after, impeccably dressed as always. James, you look disturbed. Did something happen? My files, all the data I collected about the navigation system, disappeared. How strange. Sarah made an expression of false concern. Did you make backup? James felt the world collapsing. He hadn't made backup. He had violated the basic rule of computer science due to overconfidence. Sarah touched his shoulder with feigned gentleness. James, dear, this is terrible. All that work lost. But you know, maybe it's a sign. Maybe you're forcing too much, trying to prove something you don't need to prove. The other engineers arrived for the meeting, and James had to explain that he had no data to present. David Wilson shook his head with disapproval. Unprofessional. Always making backup is basic. Jennifer Parker was more direct. James, this is serious technical work. We can't trust someone who doesn't follow basic data security protocols. Sarah observed everything with poorly disguised satisfaction. It's really a shame. James had worked so hard. But I think this shows why we prefer to work with professionals who have experience in large-scale projects. During the following week, James tried to reconstruct part of the work, but without access to the main systems, Sarah had created new security restrictions. It was impossible. He felt like a man trying to climb a mountain while someone cut the rope. Every progress he made was systematically sabotaged. Every discovery he presented was stolen or discredited. Every attempt to prove competence was transformed into a demonstration of amateurism. But James didn't give up. During the nights, he studied technical manuals he could borrow. He researched on the internet about similar cases of submarines with ballast problems. He talked on the phone with Navy veterans he knew. Slowly, methodically, he began to assemble a complete picture of what was really wrong with the USS Hampton S-30. The problem wasn't a specific system. It was a cascade of small failures that fed on each other. The ballast modification affected stability. The instability overloaded the hydraulic system. The overload generated excessive heating. The heating damaged sensors. The defective sensors sent wrong data to the central computer. The central computer, receiving conflicting data, entered safety mode and shut down vital systems. It was like a giant domino, where each piece that fell knocked down 3 others. And James was certain he knew exactly where the first piece was. A specific valve in the ballast system that had been modified by some ingenious mechanic years ago. The modification worked, but depended on precise manual calibration. When the responsible technician had retired, the knowledge had gone with him. Without the correct calibration, the modified valve had become a failure point that triggered all the other problems. James knew he was right. He could feel the logic of the failure, the cruel elegance of the problem. It was the type of cascade that university engineers couldn't see because they were looking for isolated failures, individual systems. They didn't understand that old submarines develop their own personalities, quirks, and characteristics that aren't in manuals. On Friday of the 3rd week, James asked for a private meeting with Sarah. They met in her office, a luxurious room with an ocean view, decorated with expensive artwork and photos of her with politicians and admirals. Sarah was sitting behind the mahogany desk, impeccable as always. "James, good that you asked to talk. How are the preparations for the grand finale going? Our bet is coming to an end. You have until Monday of next week." "I know what's wrong with the submarine," James said. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? How interesting. And what would that be?" "The ballast system has an artisanally modified valve that lost calibration. This valve affects stability, which overloads other systems, which generates a cascade of failures. That's why all individual diagnostics work fine, but the submarine doesn't function as a whole." Sarah observed him in silence for a long moment. And you're sure of this?" "I am. But I need total access to the submarine to do the calibration. No supervision, no interference. 2 hours of work and I'll make this submarine sail." Sarah leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "James, my dear, you really believe this, don't you? You really think you're going to succeed?" "I know I'm going to succeed." "Then why don't you tell me how you plan to do this mysterious calibration?" "Each machine has a different personality," James explained. "Calibration isn't done with instruments. It's done by feeling the vibration, listening to the sound of metal, understanding how it responds. It's knowledge you learn by working, not studying." Sarah laughed, but there was something different in the laugh this time. Less cruel, more interested. "James, you're fascinating. You really are. Here you are, after weeks of being publicly humiliated, being sabotaged at every attempt, and you still maintain this irrational confidence. It's admirable in a kind of pathetic way. It's not irrational, it's experience. Sarah got up and walked to the window. Our bet is real, James. If you really make this submarine work, I really will marry you. Do you understand what that means? James looked at her, at the elegant silhouette against the window light, at the wealth that surrounded everything around her. It means you'll discover that true knowledge has no price, and that underestimating someone can be the most expensive mistake of your life. Sarah turned to him, and for a moment James saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't amusement. It was something close to respect? Curiosity? Monday, James. 2 hours, no interference, no supervision. If you fail, you leave here and never come back. If you succeed, she paused. If you succeed, I fulfill my part of the bet. James stood up. Until Monday, then. When he reached the door, Sarah's voice stopped him. James, he turned. Do you really think you know that submarine better than engineers with doctorates? James looked into her eyes one last time. Sarah, I don't think I know. I know. And Monday, you'll know too. That night, James called his mother. Son, you sound different. Did something happen? Monday, Mom. Monday, everything will change. Will you succeed? I'm going to show all these people what really matters. Knowledge, work, and respect. Your father would be proud, my son. When James hung up, he looked at the lights of the naval base shining in the distance. Somewhere in that complex, the submarine USS Hampton S-30 was waiting for him, waiting for someone who knew how to listen to what it had to say, someone who understood that machines aren't just metal and circuits. They're work partners who deserve respect. James closed his eyes and for the first time in weeks felt completely at peace. Monday would be the day he would prove that Sarah Thompson had bet with the wrong person, and that underestimating a man who knows his craft can be the most expensive mistake a millionaire widow can make. Monday arrived with clear skies and calm seas at Newport Harbor. James woke up at 4:30 as always, but this time there was something different in the air. An expectation, a tension that made his heart beat faster. It was the day when everything would change. He put on his blue coveralls with more care than usual, checked each tool in his box, verified the instruments he had separated especially for this moment. Mary prepared coffee, stronger than usual, and watched her son with maternal concern. Are you sure about this, my son? I am, Mum. Today, all these people will discover that knowledge doesn't come only from expensive universities. May God bless you, James. Your father is protecting you from above. At the naval base, Sarah Thompson arrived 2 hours earlier than agreed. The millionaire widow was unrecognizable. Instead of impeccable suits and high heels, she wore dark jeans and low shoes. She still radiated elegance and authority. For the first time in weeks, she seemed genuinely anxious. Commander Robert found her in the meeting room, nervously shuffling through papers. Mrs. Sarah, are you all right? You seem tense. I'm curious, just that. Today we find out if James is a misunderstood genius or just another dreamer who promised too much. At 8 in the morning, the entire technical team was gathered at the pier where the submarine USS Hampton S-30 was docked. Michael Brown, David Wilson, Jennifer Parker, and 8 more engineers and technicians formed a semicircle around the vessel's entrance. Some held cameras, others tablets with monitoring equipment, all skeptical, all waiting for failure. James arrived carrying his toolbox and improvised equipment he had assembled during the weekend. A combination of industrial stethoscope, handmade vibration meter, and a pressure device he had calibrated himself. The engineers looked at that set of patched equipment with poorly disguised disdain. Sarah approached him. James, these are your 2 hours. No interference, as promised. When you fail, and you will fail, I want you to leave here with dignity and never come back. James looked into her eyes. Sarah, when I succeed, and I will succeed, I want you to remember this moment. The moment when you discovered you were completely wrong about who I am. Michael Brown checked his watch. It's 8 o'clock precisely. 2 hours for an impossible miracle. James ignored the comment and headed for the submarine's hatch. When he stepped on the metal deck, he felt a familiar vibration under his feet. Even stopped for 18 years, the USS Hampton S-30 still had personality, still had soul. He went down the main hatch and headed directly to the engine room. It was there that the heart of the problem lay. James turned on an auxiliary lighting system he had brought and began methodically examining each component of the ballast system. His hands moved with surgical precision, touching valves, feeling temperatures, hearing microscopic sounds that only trained ears could capture. After 30 minutes of silent inspection, James found exactly what he was looking for. In the main ballast system, between two seemingly identical valves, there was one that was slightly different. The welding was more worn, the metal color had its own tone, and when James put his ear to it, he could hear an almost inaudible crack. It was there, the artisanal modification made by some ingenious mechanic years ago. James smiled. "Found you, old friend. Now let's talk properly." He connected his improvised equipment to the hydraulic system and began to work. It wasn't a process that could be explained in manuals or taught in universities. It was pure experience, visceral knowledge, passed from generation to generation of mechanics who understood that machines are living beings with their own needs. James adjusted the valve pressure by millimeters, waited for the system to stabilize, adjusted again. He put his hand on the submarine's hull, feeling vibrations, listening to metallic whispers. Up on deck, Sarah was compulsively checking her watch. An hour had passed, and there was no sign from James. Michael Brown shook his head. He's wasting his time. It's impossible. David Wilson was filming everything to document the failure. Jennifer Parker was checking monitoring equipment they had installed to record any activity from the submarine's systems. All indicators remained dead. Zero energy, inactive systems, non-existent hydraulic pressure. Sarah began to feel something strange in her stomach. It wasn't relief from confirmation that she was right. It was disappointment, anxiety. She couldn't identify exactly, but part of her was secretly rooting for James to succeed. Inside the submarine, James was in the most delicate phase of the process. He had identified that the modified valve was misaligned by approximately 2.3 degrees of opening. It was a microscopic difference that no electronic equipment could measure with sufficient precision. But James's hands, calloused by years of work, felt the difference. He turned the valve slowly, listening to the sound the metal made, feeling the resistance change gradually. When he reached the exact point, something clicked inside the system. Like a lock being opened with the right key, James felt the entire submarine vibrate slightly. It was a signal. The USS Hampton S-30 was awakening after 18 years of sleep. James ran to the main control panel and turned on the auxiliary electrical system. One by one, the lights came on. The computers began to initialize. Displays that had been dark for almost 2 decades came back to life with their green and red lights. The sound of fans and electric pumps began to echo through the submarine's corridors. Up top, Jennifer Parker looked at her tablet and screamed. "The sensors are detecting electrical activity. Power rising." Everyone turned to her, incredulous. Michael checked his own instruments. "It's impossible. The electrical systems are starting up." Sarah felt her legs weaken. She leaned on the deck railing, watching the submarine's external indicators begin to blink. David Wilson was recording frantically, documenting something he considered impossible. Impossible! How is this possible? Inside the submarine, James wasn't finished. Electrical systems were just the beginning. Now he needed to test the main mechanical systems. He went to the propulsion control room and began activating the auxiliary diesel engines. The sound of engines starting after 18 years of silence was almost religious. James closed his eyes and whispered a quick prayer. "Father, let your hands guide mine. Let this work honor all the men who came before me." The main engine groaned, hesitated, and then roared back to life with a sound that echoed throughout the naval base. The entire submarine vibrated like a metal giant awakening from deep sleep. Hydraulic systems hissed, gaining pressure. Air compressors began to work. The USS Hampton S-30 was alive. After 18 years, it was alive. On deck, the silence was total for 5 seconds before exploding in shouts and exclamations. Jennifer Parker had tears in her eyes, looking at her instruments that showed all systems functioning within normal parameters. Michael Brown had gone pale, frantically working on his tablet as if he could find a technical explanation for what he was witnessing. David Wilson repeated "impossible, impossible" like a mantra. The Brazilian technicians at the naval base began clapping and shouting. Some were crying openly. Commander Robert was radiant, speaking on the radio with Navy headquarters. "Ma'am, the submarine is working. I repeat, the USS Hampton S-30 is fully operational." And Sarah Thompson was in absolute shock. The millionaire widow who had spent weeks humiliating James, mocking him, sabotaging his work, was seeing the impossible happen before her eyes. The mechanic without a degree, whom she had treated as entertainment, had just accomplished something that 15 international specialists couldn't achieve in years of attempts. James emerged from the submarine's hatch with his face dirty with grease and oil, but smiling. His clothes were soaked with sweat. His hands trembled slightly from exhaustion, but his eyes shone with deep satisfaction. He looked directly at Sarah. "The submarine is ready for navigation, all systems operational." Sarah couldn't speak. For the first time in her adult life, she was completely speechless. Michael Brown approached James, visibly shaken. "How did you do it? What method did you use? How is this possible?" James wiped his hands on a cloth. "Respect. I respected the machine. I listened to what it had to say." Jennifer Parker was examining technical readouts on her tablet. "James, all system parameters are better than original specifications. How did you achieve this? The submarine is operating above design capacity. Each machine has its own personality," James explained patiently. "The Hampton wasn't defective. It had just lost its original adjustment when the responsible technician retired. I simply restored the calibration it needed." David Wilson approached with visible respect. "Sir, could you teach us this method? Is it something that can be documented?" James looked at Sarah, who remained silent, observing everything with an unrecognizable expression. "It's not something you teach in a classroom. It's something you learn by working, respecting, listening. It takes years to develop." Commander Robert was euphoric. "James, this is extraordinary. The entire Navy will want to know how you did this. We need to document everything, prepare reports." "Later, Commander," James answered without taking his eyes off Sarah. "Now I have a private conversation to have." Sarah finally found her voice. "How?" she whispered. "How did you know?" James approached her slowly. "For 3 weeks, you humiliated me, sabotaged me, treated me like I was a clown. You stole my work, deleted my files, made me entertainment for your rich friends." He paused. "But all this time I was paying attention. Not just to the submarine, but to you too. And you know what I discovered, Sarah?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "You're not cruel by nature. You're cruel out of fear." Sarah felt tears rising to her eyes. "What are you talking about? You're afraid that people like me, simple people who work with their hands, might know things you don't know. This threatens your worldview, where money and diplomas determine who deserves respect." Sarah began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. James continued with a gentle voice. "You spent weeks trying to break me because you were afraid I might succeed. And then you'd have to admit you were wrong about who I am, about who you are." Sarah tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. James extended his hand to her. "Our bet still stands, Sarah. You said you'd marry me if I made the submarine work. She looked at his extended hand, at his gentle eyes, at the working submarine behind him. I don't understand, she whispered. How can you still want to marry me after everything I did to you? James smiled. Because underneath all that cruelty, I saw a lost woman, afraid, trying to prove something to herself and the world. And because I believe people can change when they discover who they really are. Sarah looked around. All the engineers, technicians, and officers were watching. The entire naval base had stopped to see the outcome of that impossible story. The mechanic without a degree and the millionaire widow before a submarine that had defied specialists from around the world. James, she said finally, her voice trembling, you made me realize things about myself that I didn't want to see. Ugly, cruel things. How can you forgive that? Because, Sarah, James said softly, forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to believe that tomorrow you can be better than today. Sarah closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and when she opened them again, there was something different in them. A humility that had never been there before, a vulnerability she had always hidden behind wealth and arrogance. James Mitchell, she said clearly, so everyone could hear, you succeeded. Did something I thought was impossible. Proved I was completely wrong about you, and she hesitated for a moment, then continued with a firm voice, and I keep my word. If you still want it, I accept marrying you. The silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause. The American technicians shouted and whistled. Commander Robert was grinning from ear to ear. Even the foreign engineers seemed moved by that cinematic twist. James held Sarah's hand gently. I don't want you to marry me because of a bet, Sarah. I want you to marry because you chose to. Because you saw who I really am and decided you want to build something with me. Sarah squeezed his hand. That's exactly what I'm choosing, James. At that moment, with the midday sun beating on the submarine's deck, with the sound of engines running perfectly in the background, Sarah Thompson discovered that true wealth wasn't in her bank accounts. It was in the humility to recognize when you're wrong, the courage to ask forgiveness, and the wisdom to value knowledge wherever it may be. And James Mitchell discovered that his greatest victory hadn't been making the submarine work. It had been touching the heart of a lost woman and helping her find her way back home. 3 days after the submarine miracle, news had spread throughout maritime America. The story of the mechanic who achieved the impossible and won the heart of a millionaire widow made headlines in all specialized newspapers. But inside Sarah Thompson's luxurious office in Charleston, a storm was forming. Dr. Charles Anderson, the main company investor, was red with rage. His fists pounded the mahogany table with enough force to make the picture frames shake. Sarah, this is unacceptable. You can't be serious. Marry a mechanic? A woman of your social position? Sarah was sitting behind the desk, impeccably dressed as always, but there was something different in her posture, a serenity that didn't exist before. Dr. Charles, James accomplished in 2 hours what our specialists couldn't in 3 years. Maybe it's time we examined our prejudices. Linda Wilson, the same one who had mocked James during the wives' lunch, was present at the meeting. She shook her head in disbelief. Sarah, dear, you're in post-traumatic shock. This will pass. You can't really be considering marrying that man. That man, Sarah repeated calmly, has a name, James Mitchell, and he just saved this company from imminent bankruptcy. The working submarine means $300 million in contracts we can fulfill again. Patricia Harris, wife of the investor who had participated in the public humiliation, laughed sarcastically. Sarah, be realistic. What are you going to do? Take this mechanic to diplomatic dinners, to meetings with ministers? You think he knows how to use a fish fork? Knows how to talk about art, politics, economics? Sarah felt an old anger rising, but this time directed to the right side. Patricia, in the last 3 years, how many times have you and your husband dined with me talking about the importance of classical education and refined culture? And how many times did any of you solve a real problem, create something useful, or truly contribute to anything? Dr. Charles leaned forward threateningly. Sarah, you're emotionally compromised. We'll schedule a board meeting to discuss your leadership capacity. Maybe it's time for you to step back until you recover from this phase. The threat was clear. They were planning to remove her from company leadership. Sarah stood slowly and walked to the window overlooking the ocean. You know what my biggest mistake was in the last 3 years? The silence in the room was tense. Trying to impress you, trying to prove I was worthy of respect from people who never created real value, who live off inheritance and empty criticism. She turned to face everyone. James showed me something you never could teach. Humility, real work, the ability to recognize when you're wrong and correct course. Linda laughed nervously. But Sarah, you can't be serious about this marriage. It was a bet, a joke that got out of control. It was the most serious decision I've made in my life, Sarah responded. And if you can't accept that, maybe it's time to reconsider your participation in this company. The meeting ended with mutual threats and a toxic environment that made clear the next weeks would be war. Meanwhile, in Newport Harbor, James faced his own challenges. Sudden notoriety had attracted unwanted attention. Reporters camped at his house door. Photographers chased him and Mary on trips to the market, and the phone didn't stop ringing with job offers from across the country. But the biggest challenge was emotional. James was in love with Sarah, but knew the reality of America's social abysses. He knew that marrying her meant entering a world that wasn't his, facing prejudices that would go beyond anything he had experienced until then. On Thursday of that week, Sarah called James. We need to talk, in person. Can you come to Charleston on Saturday? James hesitated. Is this about the investors? They didn't like our decision. It's about many things, James. We need to define some important points. On Saturday, James took the bus to Charleston. It was the first time he visited the mountain region, and the difference in social reality was striking. Huge houses, luxury cars, people dressed as if they were going to diplomatic events just to go to the bakery. When he arrived at the gate of Sarah's mansion, James felt the weight of what he was facing. The house was a palace, 3 floors, gardens that looked like parks, a garage with 5 cars that cost more than entire houses in his neighborhood. Sarah received him at the door, wearing a simple but elegant dress. For the first time, James saw her without elaborate makeup, without the social armor she always wore. She was nervous. James, good that you came. You need to know my reality before making any definitive decision about our future. She guided him through the house, showing living rooms, libraries, offices, paintings that cost fortunes. James observed everything in silence, trying to process the magnitude of the difference between their worlds. Sarah took him to a second-floor terrace overlooking all of Charleston. They sat in expensive wicker chairs, with a center table that probably cost more than James's annual salary. The silence lasted several minutes before Sarah spoke. James, I need to be honest with you about what marrying me means. This isn't just about us two. It's about facing a society that will question every step we take. It's about dinners where you'll be observed as zoological curiosity. It's about meetings where they'll test your knowledge about subjects that have nothing to do with your competence. She paused. It's about my family, my friends, my entire social circle doubting you, pressuring me to give up, treating you as if you were a phase I'll get over. Are you prepared for this? James observed her for a long moment. Are you trying to convince me to give up? I'm trying to make sure you know what you're getting into, because once we make this official, there's no going back. Either we face it together, or we destroy each other trying. James stood and walked to the terrace railing. He looked at the luxurious landscape around, and then turned to Sarah. Sarah, in recent days many people ask me if I'm prepared for your world, but nobody asked if you're prepared for mine. She frowned. "What do you mean? Are you prepared to wake up at 5 in the morning and have black coffee with bread and butter? Are you prepared to visit my mother in Riverside District where houses are attached and there's no garden? Are you prepared to go to the simple community church where there's no air conditioning and everyone knows each other?" Sarah remained quiet, processing. "Are you prepared to understand that my wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in knowing my trade, having true friends, being able to look in the mirror and know I built everything with my own work?" James approached her. "Because if you're expecting me to change to fit into your world, this won't work." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I never thought about it from that angle. I always assumed you would adapt to my lifestyle standard." James sat beside her. "Sarah, I don't want you to give up your life. I want us to build a new life. That's ours. That has the best of both worlds, but that's honest about who we really are." "And who are we really?" she asked. "We're two people who met through a broken submarine and discovered they're stronger together than apart. You're an intelligent, capable woman who was just lost, trying to prove things to the wrong people. And I'm a man who knows his worth, who won't diminish himself to make anyone comfortable, but who's willing to learn and grow with the right person." Sarah took his hand. "What if my friends and family never accept you? What if there's always social tension? Then we'll create our own family. It's not about them accepting you or me. It's about us accepting each other completely." James caressed her face. "But you need to decide, Sarah. What's more important? The opinion of people you don't even like that much, or the chance to build something real with someone who truly sees you?" Sarah closed her eyes, and when she opened them, there was determination in them. "I want to build something real with you, James. I don't know how it'll be. I don't know what challenges we'll face, but I know I don't want to waste more time trying to impress people who will never truly value me." They kissed for the first time there on the terrace, with the city of Charleston stretching below them. It was a kiss that sealed not just a romantic commitment, but a decision to face the world as a team. When they separated, James smiled. "Then let's do this right. I want to ask for your hand in marriage formally, in front of your family and my friends. I want it to be official, to be public, so nobody can say later it was impulse or fantasy." Sarah laughed, the first genuinely happy laugh she had given in years. "Are you prepared to meet my mother? She lives in Boston and is even more critical than the investors." James laughed out loud. "If I survived Michael Brown questioning my technical competence, I think I can survive any mother-in-law." The following week, events precipitated rapidly. Dr. Charles Anderson called an extraordinary meeting of the investor board to discuss Sarah's removal from the directorship. The official justification was emotional decisions harmful to business. The real justification was the inability to accept that a woman of her class would marry a mechanic. At the same time, James was approached by the United States Navy with an extraordinary proposal. The Naval Command wanted to hire him as a special consultant for recovery of out-of-operation vessels. The salary offered was $35,000 monthly, plus benefits, to work part-time recovering ships that international specialists had considered total losses. It was the professional recognition that James always deserved, but that came at the most complicated moment possible. Accepting meant financial security and professional respect. Refusing meant betting everything on the relationship with Sarah and facing a life of social uncertainties. On the eve of the board meeting, Sarah called James. "They want to remove me from the company. They think marrying you is proof of mental instability. And you? What do you think?" James asked. "I think for the first time in my life, I'm making a decision based on what I feel is right, not on what people will think of me." That night, James talked at length with Mary. "Mom, do you think I'm doing the right thing?" "Son, your father always said, we don't marry the perfect person. We marry the person we want to face life's imperfections with. And this Sarah, she seems like a woman who's learning to be true. That's rare, my son. On the morning of the board meeting, Sarah woke up with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She knew exactly what she needed to do. She wore her best suit, prepared a folder with documents she had organized during the early hours, and drove to the company headquarters with the serenity of someone who had made an irreversible decision. Arriving there, she found James waiting in the reception, wearing a simple but well-cut suit he had bought, especially for the occasion. "What are you doing here?" she asked, surprised. "I came to support my future wife at the most important meeting of her career. If we're going to be partners, let's be for real." Sarah felt her heart accelerate. "Are you sure? It's going to be difficult. They'll try to humiliate you, disqualify you." James smiled and offered his arm. "Sarah, I spent 3 weeks being humiliated by you and didn't give up. Do you think I'll give up now that we're on the same side?" When they entered the boardroom together, the silence was sepulchral. The 10 most powerful investors in the American naval industry watched Sarah Thompson enter arm in arm with the mechanic who had become the sector's most controversial subject. Dr. Charles Anderson stood up slowly. "Sarah, this is a board meeting. Only authorized members can participate. James doesn't have credentials to be here." Sarah walked to the head of the table. "Dr. Charles, before we begin this meeting, I'd like to make some announcements that will define this company's future. And the first announcement is that James Mitchell isn't here as a visitor." She opened her folder and removed documents she made sure everyone could see. "He's here as the new Director of Naval Technical Operations, a position I just created, and for which he's officially hired with a salary of $65,000 monthly." The bomb exploded in the room. Shouts of protest, fists on the table, threats of investment withdrawal. But Sarah wasn't finished. "And the second announcement," she continued, raising her voice above the confusion, "is that James and I are getting married in 30 days, in a ceremony that will be covered by the specialized press as an example of valuing Brazilian practical knowledge." Dr. Charles was red with rage. "Sarah, you've gone completely insane. I'm calling for immediate voting for your removal. You're no longer capable of leading this company." "You can vote," Sarah replied calmly. "But first, I'd like you to read these documents." She distributed copies of a report she had prepared during the early hours. In the last 48 hours, James identified and corrected operational failures in 3 more vessels in our fleet. Problems that our dear international consultants misdiagnosed months ago. The financial result of his corrections already exceeds by $20 million the annual cost of his hiring. Linda Wilson leafed through the report incredulously. "This is impossible. How did he achieve this so quickly?" "Because he understands machines in a way you can't buy," Sarah replied, "and because we finally have someone focused on solving real problems instead of impressing investors with pretty presentations." The meeting that had begun as Sarah's trial was transforming into a results presentation that nobody could contest. But the real surprise was yet to come. The real surprise that Sarah had reserved for the end of the board meeting left the room in absolute silence. She removed from her folder an official document with the United States Navy letterhead. Commander Robert entered the meeting room at the exact moment, impeccably uniformed, carrying a military folder. "Gentlemen investors," Sarah announced, "I'd like to present Commander Robert Davis, who has important information about this company's future." The commander positioned himself beside James and opened his folder. "By order of the Navy High Command, I have the pleasure to inform that Thompson Naval has been selected as exclusive partner for the American Submarine Fleet Recovery Project." Dr. Charles Anderson tried to interrupt, but the commander continued. "The project involves recovery of 12 submarines considered total losses, with total budget of $1.2 billion distributed over 5 years. The technical condition for the contract is that all work be supervised by specialist James Mitchell." Linda Wilson dropped the papers she was holding. 1.2 billion, she stammered. Commander Robert confirmed. Mr. James's demonstration of competence with the USS Hampton convinced our technical command that traditional American methods are superior to international consultancies. We want to recover our naval technological autonomy. Patricia Harris looked at James with a mixture of shock and growing respect. But, Commander, James doesn't have formal international certifications. The commander smiled. Mrs. Patricia, certifications don't make submarines work. Competence does. And Mr. James just proved competence that no university teaches. Sarah observed the expressions around the table gradually change from contempt to financial calculation. $1.2 billion was too much money to be ignored due to social prejudice. Dr. Charles cleared his throat nervously. Well, maybe we can reconsider some positions, if the Naval Command has confidence. No, Sarah interrupted him firmly. We're not going to reconsider anything based on financial convenience. You spent weeks trying to humiliate me for valuing James. Now that you discovered he's worth $1.2 billion, you want to change your opinion. It doesn't work that way. She stood and walked through the room. For years, you criticized my husband Michael for valuing practical knowledge. You called him sentimental, outdated. Now you're seeing he was right all along. James represents exactly the type of professional this country needs to value. Linda tried a conciliatory smile. Sarah, dear, maybe we all got ahead of ourselves. The important thing is the company's good. The company's good, Sarah cut her off, is to have leadership that makes decisions based on competence, not social prejudice. And that leadership is me, supported by James. Dr. Charles was visibly uncomfortable. Sarah, about the marriage issue. We can discuss better. The marriage issue is not up for discussion, Sarah replied. James and I are getting married in 30 days. You can accept this and continue as investors, or you can sell your shares. The choice is yours. The silence that followed was broken by Patricia Harris. If I may say, perhaps I judged precipitately. James's work with the submarines is really impressive. Sarah smiled coldly. Patricia, you spent weeks mocking his intelligence. I won't forget that easily. Commander Robert observed everything with interest. Mr. James, the Navy would also like to make a personal proposal. Besides the company contract, we want to invite you to a permanent technical consultant position, salary of $70,000 monthly, complete benefits, and autonomy to form your own specialist team. James, who had remained quiet during most of the meeting, finally spoke. Commander, I accept with pleasure, but I have one condition. The team I'm going to form will give priority to professionals like me, people with real practical experience, regardless of university degrees. The commander smiled. Exactly what we expected to hear. The Navy is interested in results, not resumes. Linda Wilson was calculating mentally. With these contracts, Sarah, the company will have the biggest growth in American naval sector history. You'll be extremely successful. Sarah looked at James, who nodded slightly. Linda, for 3 weeks you and your friends treated me as entertainment. You laughed at James, mocked our story. Now you want to participate in our success? James stood and spoke for the first time, addressing the investors directly. Gentlemen, I accept working with you professionally because this benefits the country and the Navy. But I won't pretend to forget how you treated me. I hope you use this as a lesson about not judging people by appearance or social origin. Doctor, Charles tried to apologize. James, if we exaggerated in our concerns— Exaggerated, James interrupted him. You tried to prevent Sarah from hiring me based exclusively on my social class. That wasn't exaggeration, it was pure prejudice. The important thing is that we learn from this and move forward. The commander intervened diplomatically. America needs more professionals like James and less prejudice against practical knowledge. The meeting ended with investors reluctantly accepting the new reality. Sarah had won completely, not only maintained her position, but expanded the company and guaranteed both their futures. When they left the room, James held Sarah's hand. "You were incredible in there. Thank you for defending me that way." Sarah squeezed his hand. "James, you taught me to have courage to fight for what's right. It was the least I could do." 30 days later, St. Joseph's Church in the Riverside district was decorated with simple but loving flowers. The wedding ceremony of James Mitchell and Sarah Thompson had become the most talked-about event in East Coast society. On the bride's side was the business and social elite of Charleston. On the groom's side were workers, mechanics, fishermen, and their families. It was a social mixture that normally only happened in movies, but there it was happening in real life. Mary, James's mother, was in the front row, wearing a blue dress that Sarah had personally chosen for her. Beside her, Sarah's mother, Elizabeth, who had traveled from Boston, initially shocked, but gradually won over by James's genuine humility. Father Michael from the local community celebrated the ceremony. He was a simple man who had known James since childhood and had been moved when the young man asked to marry in the church where he grew up. "My brothers," the priest said during the homily, "today we celebrate more than a union. We celebrate proof that true love overcomes social barriers." Sarah, who insisted everyone call her by her simple name during the ceremony, was radiant in an elegant but not ostentatious dress. James wore a navy blue suit that perfectly matched the occasion's simplicity. When it came time for vows, James spoke first. "Sarah, you taught me that true transformation comes from humility. I promise to be your companion in all adventures to come, value your intelligence, support your dreams, and always remember that we're stronger together than apart." Sarah wiped a tear before speaking. "James, you showed me that true wealth is in character, honest work, the ability to see value where others see flaws. I promise to learn from you every day, honor your family as mine, and build a life based on what really matters." When the priest pronounced "you are married," the applause that echoed through the church mixed the genuine emotion of the local community with the reluctant but real respect of the social elite. Commander Robert, who served as military best man, embraced James. "Welcome to the naval family, my friend. Your career is just beginning." At the wedding party, held at the Riverside District Community Club, three worlds mixed, surprisingly. Local fishermen talked with businessmen about navigation techniques. Investors' wives learned traditional recipes from Mary. Dr. Charles Anderson, who had tried to destroy Sarah professionally, approached the couple during the party. "Sarah, James, I owe public apologies. I allowed prejudice to cloud my professional judgment. James, your work is extraordinary and deserves all recognition." James shook his hand. "Dr. Charles, the important thing is we learn from each other. I have much to learn about business management, and maybe you can learn something about practical engineering." The most emotional moment of the party was when Robert Santos, the veteran mechanic who had taught James in his youth, arrived from Virginia, especially for the wedding. "James, boy," the old man said with tears in his eyes, "you did everything I always knew you could do. You showed the whole country that true knowledge has no social class." Sarah hugged Robert. "Thank you for teaching my husband to be the extraordinary man he is." During the party, Sarah announced the creation of the Michael Thompson Foundation for Practical Knowledge Valorization. With initial budget of $15 million, the foundation would offer scholarships for young workers, specialization courses for mechanics and technicians, and exchange programs between universities and workshops. "James will be the foundation's technical director," Sarah explained to the guests. "We're going to prove that America can be a world leader in practical solutions to real problems." 6 months later, transformation was visible throughout the region. Robert Johnson's workshop, where James had worked, became a technical school of excellence. Newport Naval Base became an international reference center for vessel recovery. The submarine USS Hampton S-30 operated with performance superior to original specifications, serving as an example for navies from other countries. But the most important change was personal. Sarah had discovered a passion for social work she never knew existed. She spent her days visiting technical schools, talking with young workers, learning about realities that her privileged education had never shown. James had become not just a respected specialist, but a symbol that competence can come from anywhere. On their first wedding anniversary, they were on the deck of the USS Hampton S-30, watching the sunset over Newport Harbor. Sarah, now wearing simple and practical clothes most of the time, leaned on James's shoulder. "Can you imagine where we'd be if you had given up that first day?" James laughed. "You'd probably still be trying to impress people who aren't worth it, and I'd still be fixing small boats without realizing my potential." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the sound of the submarine's engines running perfectly. "James," Sarah said finally, "do you think our story can inspire other people? I think our story proves that transformation is possible when we have courage to recognize when we're wrong and change." James pointed to the naval base, where several young workers were being trained by experienced veterans. "Look there, we're creating an entire generation of professionals who won't need to prove value to anyone. They'll know from early on that competence is respected regardless of social class." Sarah smiled. "And we're proving that prejudice is expensive stupidity. It cost years of stopped submarine and almost cost an entire company." While they talked, a young mechanic approached timidly. "Dr. James, sorry to interrupt, but I managed to make that hydraulic pump work using your manual calibration technique. Congratulations, Kevin." James replied. "You're learning to listen to the machine. Keep it up." When the young man walked away, Sarah observed, "He calls you doctor without you having a doctorate. True respect comes from demonstrated competence, not purchased titles." James agreed. "And you know what else? This boy will teach others who will teach others more. Practical knowledge multiplies when it's valued." That night at home, they received an exciting call. Mary had news to give. "Son, I just learned that the City Hall will name you Honorary Citizen of Newport Harbor. And Sarah, too. You changed the entire city." James looked at his wife, who was smiling with genuine pride. "Sarah, when I met you, you were a lost woman trying to prove value through money and status. Today, you're someone who found true purpose helping others. And you," Sarah replied, "when I met you, were a talented man who accepted being invisible because society said your place was small. Today, you're living proof that our place is where our competence can shine." They embraced, knowing they had achieved something rare, transforming not just their own lives, but creating waves of change that would continue spreading. The submarine USS Hampton S-30 would continue sailing as a symbol that impossible problems have solutions when we find the right people. And James Mitchell and Sarah Thompson would continue proving that true love is capable of breaking any social barrier when based on mutual respect and genuine values. Their story would become legend in the American Navy, an example that competence has no social class and inspiration for young workers across the country who learned that true knowledge always finds its place in the world. 2 years after their wedding, the transformation in Newport Harbor was so profound that the city had become a case study for technical education programs across America. What started as one man's fight for respect had evolved into a movement that was changing how the country viewed practical knowledge and social mobility. The Michael Thompson Foundation for Practical Knowledge Valorization had grown beyond anyone's expectations. With James as technical director and Sarah managing strategic partnerships, they had established 12 technical training centers across the East Coast. Each center combined traditional academic education with hands-on workshops taught by experienced professionals like James. The Foundation's first graduation ceremony was held at Newport Naval Base in the same hangar where the USS Hampton S-30 was originally housed. 150 young men and women, ages 18 to 25, from working-class families across 5 states, received certificates in advanced naval mechanics, submarine systems, and maritime engineering. What made the ceremony special wasn't just the graduation itself, but who was in the audience. Sitting in the front row were Admiral William Carter, Chief of Naval Operations, Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, Secretary of Education, and Robert Johnson, the workshop owner who had given James his first real opportunity outside the base. But the seat of honor was reserved for Mary Mitchell, James's mother, who watched with tears of joy as her son delivered the keynote address to graduates who reminded her so much of the teenager James had once been. "My friends," James said from the podium, wearing his dress naval uniform. He had been commissioned as honorary commander the previous year. "You are graduating today not just with technical skills, but with something much more valuable. The confidence to know that your knowledge has worth regardless of where you come from. 2 years ago, I stood in a room full of people who looked at my coveralls and decided I had nothing valuable to contribute. Today, those same people seek my advice on projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. What changed wasn't my knowledge, it was their willingness to listen." The applause was thunderous, but James raised his hand for quiet. "But here's what I want you to remember. You don't need anyone's permission to be excellent. You don't need a diploma from an expensive university to solve real problems. What you need is respect for your craft, dedication to learning, and the courage to stand up for what you know is right." In the audience, Sarah wiped away a tear. Watching her husband inspire these young people, seeing the confidence in their eyes, she understood that their personal transformation had become something much larger than either of them had imagined. After the ceremony, they held a reception in the base's main hall. The social mixing that had once seemed impossible at their wedding was now routine. Admiral Carter chatted easily with Kevin Thompson, the young mechanic James had mentored, about innovations in submarine maintenance. Dr. Morgan discussed curriculum development with Jennifer Parker, who had left her prestigious consulting firm to teach at the foundation. But the most meaningful conversation happened in a quiet corner where Dr. Charles Anderson approached Mary Mitchell. "Mrs. Mary," he said, his voice respectful in a way it had never been during those first difficult meetings, "I owe you an apology. I judged your son by everything, except what mattered most, his character and his abilities." Mary smiled gently. "Dr. Anderson, James never held grudges. He always said people can change when they're ready to see truth. What matters is what we do with the lessons we learn." Charles nodded, visibly moved. "Your son changed my understanding of what real value looks like. I'm a better man because of his example." The foundation's success had created ripple effects throughout American industry. Major corporations were establishing partnerships to recruit graduates. The Navy had expanded its practical knowledge initiative to all branches of the military. 3 states had modified their technical education requirements to include hands-on experience as equivalent to traditional academic credits. But perhaps the most significant change was happening in the boardrooms and social circles, where people like Sarah had once defined success solely by wealth and pedigree. The monthly investor meetings at Thompson Naval were now models of merit-based decision-making. During one particularly memorable meeting, Linda Wilson, the same woman who had once mocked James at that humiliating lunch, stood to address the board. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, looking directly at James, who now held the title of Chief Technical Officer, "I want to publicly acknowledge something. 3 years ago, I participated in behavior that I'm deeply ashamed of. I mocked James Mitchell because he didn't fit my narrow definition of expertise. I was wrong, and my prejudice nearly cost this company the most valuable asset it has ever acquired." She turned to face the full board. "James hasn't just revolutionized our technical capabilities. He's shown us that our old ways of evaluating people were not just unfair, they were stupid. We were throwing away talent because we couldn't see past our own biases." The room was silent as Linda continued. "I've learned more about leadership from watching James work with his team than I learned in 20 years of business school and consulting seminars. Real leadership isn't about commanding from an office. It's about understanding your people, respecting their knowledge, and creating conditions for everyone to contribute their best. When Linda finished, the applause was immediate and sustained. But James stood up, gesturing for quiet. "Mrs. Wilson, I appreciate your words more than you know. But I want everyone in this room to understand something. The goal was never to prove anyone wrong. The goal was to prove that we're all stronger when we value each person's contribution." That evening, as James and Sarah drove home to the house they had built together, a modest but beautiful place that perfectly blended her taste for elegance with his preference for simplicity, Sarah reflected on how completely their lives had changed. The house itself was symbolic of their journey. It had Sarah's library filled with business books and James's workshop where he continued to experiment with mechanical innovations. The living room displayed both Sarah's collection of maritime art and James's tools from his early days, now mounted in places of honor. Their social life had transformed as well. Their closest friends included both Admiral Carter and Robert Santos, the retired mechanic who had become James's unofficial mentor. Their dinner parties brought together Navy officers, Foundation graduates, business leaders, and skilled workers in conversations that would have been impossible 3 years earlier. But the most meaningful transformation was in their relationship itself. Sarah had discovered that the security she had always sought through wealth and status was actually found in the trust and partnership she shared with James. And James had learned that success didn't require him to choose between his values and his ambitions. On a quiet Sunday morning, exactly 3 years after the day James first walked into that humiliating board meeting, they received a call that would bring their story full circle. Commander Robert Davis was on the line with news that made them both smile. "James," the commander said, "I'm calling with an official request. The Secretary of the Navy wants to know if you would consider leading a new initiative, the National Maritime Technical Excellence Program. It would mean working directly with Congress to establish practical knowledge programs in every state. The salary," the commander continued, "would be $150,000 annually, plus full benefits, and you'd have complete autonomy to structure the program according to your vision. It would also mean Sarah could expand the foundation nationally with full federal support." James looked at Sarah, who was listening on the speakerphone. "What do you think, partner? Should we take on Washington?" Sarah grinned. "I think it's time to show the whole country what we've learned about valuing real talent." 6 months later, James Mitchell stood before a joint session of Congress, wearing his dress uniform and carrying a simple briefcase that contained the same tools he had used to fix the USS Hampton S-30. He was there to present the Maritime Technical Excellence Act, bipartisan legislation that would revolutionize how America trained and valued its technical workforce. Senators and representatives from both parties had endorsed the bill after visiting Newport Harbor and seeing the results of the Foundation's work. The economic impact alone was impressive. The 12 training centers had generated over $500 million in increased productivity and innovation, but more importantly, they had created pathways for thousands of young Americans to achieve meaningful careers without traditional college debt. "Mr. Speaker," James began, addressing the House chamber filled with the most powerful politicians in America. "3 years ago, I was a mechanic who many people thought didn't belong in important conversations. Today, I stand before you not because I changed who I am, but because America changed how it sees people like me. The program I'm proposing will create technical education opportunities for 100,000 young Americans over the next 5 years. These won't be second-tier alternatives to college. They'll be first-rate pathways to careers that our economy desperately needs. But this program will do something even more important than train workers. It will prove to the world that American democracy works best when it truly creates opportunities for everyone, regardless of their background, to contribute their talents to our nation's success." The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes. In the gallery, Sarah sat with Mary, both women barely able to contain their pride and emotion. Beside them sat Dr. Charles Anderson, Linda Wilson, and dozens of foundation graduates who had traveled to Washington to witness this historic moment. That evening, at a celebration dinner hosted by the Secretary of the Navy, James and Sarah found themselves at the head table with some of the most influential people in American government and business. But the conversation that mattered most to them was with Kevin Thompson, the young mechanic who had become the Foundation's most successful graduate. Kevin was now leading a team that had developed revolutionary submarine battery technology, innovations that were already being adopted by navies worldwide. "Dr. James," he said, using the title that had become natural even though James had never claimed it, "I want you to know that everything I've achieved started with watching you work that first day on the Hampton. You showed me that expertise isn't about impressing people with fancy words. It's about understanding your craft so deeply that you can make impossible things possible. And more than that, you showed me that success means lifting others up, not keeping them down." James put his hand on the young man's shoulder. "Kevin, the teacher's greatest success is when the student surpasses him. You've already done that, and you're just getting started." Later that night, in their hotel room overlooking the Potomac River, James and Sarah stood at the window, watching the lights of the nation's capital. In the distance, they could see the Capitol building where James had just made history, becoming the first person without a college degree to address Congress on educational policy. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Sarah asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "When I was so horrible to you and you could have just walked away?" James smiled. "I think about it every day. Not the humiliation. I think about the moment I decided not to let your fear define my worth. And I think about how you chose to change, even when it meant admitting you were wrong in front of everyone who mattered to you. That took more courage than fixing any submarine." Sarah turned to face him. "What do you think happens next?" "We've achieved more than we ever dreamed possible." James took her hand. "I think we keep doing what we've always done. Treat people with respect, value real contribution over empty credentials, and remember that our success means nothing if we don't use it to help others." They stood together in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other across an impossible social divide and built something beautiful from their differences. Outside their window, America slept, but across the country, in technical schools and naval bases, in workshops and corporate boardrooms, the changes they had started continued to grow. The next morning, newspapers across the nation carried headlines about the historic congressional address and the passage of the Maritime Technical Excellence Act. But in Newport Harbor, the most important story was being written by young people like Kevin, who were proving every day that talent and determination matter more than pedigree. The USS Hampton S-30, now fully restored to better-than-new condition, continued to serve as both a functional submarine and a powerful symbol. Tours of the vessel had become a pilgrimage site for students and workers who wanted to see where one man's refusal to accept limitations had changed everything. And in the small house where Mary Mitchell still lived, she kept a framed photo on her kitchen table. It showed her son and daughter-in-law at their wedding, smiling with joy and hope. Next to it was a newer photo, James addressing Congress, with Sarah in the gallery, both of them surrounded by the young people whose lives they had helped transform. Mary looked at those photos every morning with her coffee, remembering her late husband's words. "Talent is everywhere, but opportunity isn't." Sometimes it takes someone special to make sure talent gets its chance to shine. James Mitchell had been that someone special. But more importantly, he had shown thousands of other young people that they could be special too, if they had the courage to trust in their own abilities and the determination to prove their worth through excellent work. Their story had become America's story, a reminder that the nation's greatest strength lay not in its institutions or its wealth, but in its willingness to recognize and develop the talents of all its people, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. The submarine still sailed, stronger than ever. The marriage still flourished, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. And the dream lived on, in every young person who learned that their background didn't have to limit their future. In the end, James and Sarah had proved the most American truth of all, that with hard work, genuine respect for others, and the courage to stand up for what's right, anyone can change not just their own life, but the lives of countless others. The ripples of their transformation would continue spreading for generations, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with one person's refusal to accept that things can't change. Their love story had become a national inspiration, but more than that, it had become a blueprint for the kind of society America could be, one where worth is measured by contribution, where respect is earned through character, and where every person has the opportunity to rise as high as their talents and determination can take them.